Hello and welcome to the New Lines podcast. I'm Lydia Wilson, and this is a podcast where we delve into some of the biggest ideas, events, and personalities in the Middle East and beyond. Today's podcast is part of the magazine's new series focusing on histories and philosophies. Our guest today is Ahmed El Shamsy, Professor of Islamic Thought at the University of Chicago. Ahmed's interest is in the intellectual history of Islam, examining the historical and political contexts that give rise to different traditions, and sometimes which lead to their decline. Ahmed's latest book, Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, How Editors and Print Culture Transformed an Intellectual Tradition, upended previous understandings of the intellectual changes during the 19th and 20th centuries in the Arabic-speaking world, a time of increasing European presence in the region and of huge social and technological change. It's a groundbreaking work, tracing the origins and evolution of Arabic language printing and the impact on scholarship in the Arab world. He is currently writing a book entitled Genealogies of Sunnism, tracing the formulation of the Sunni school of thought. Ahmed, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, your work really brings home the accidental nature of history, and I mean that both in terms of what happened in the past being shaped by specific events and actions with unimaginable and certainly unintended consequences, but also in how that past is excavated, the act, if you like, of being a historian. In fact, you open the book with one such accident. You stumble across a manuscript in Egypt's National Library. You were in the archive researching one thing, but you came across something else, which resulted in an entirely separate field of inquiry and the book. Can you tell us that story?
Yes, so I was researching for my dissertation, and my dissertation was on the 9th century, on the emergence of Islamic law in that period. And I came across a manuscript that was exciting. It was something that previous scholarship didn't know still existed, was still around. And so it was a manuscript from the 9th century, but the question is when this manuscript was produced. And I had some problems dating, finding out kind of the Islamic dating calendar, the Hijri dating calendar. One has to kind of calculated to find out when it was in the Common Era calendar. And it turned out, after some confusion, that this manuscript had been copied in the early 20th century. And that really was something that totally surprised me, because I was, I had to stop for a moment and think, well, the early people were still copying manuscripts in the early 20th century. What didn't they use print already in that period? And so even though I was trying to write a dissertation on the 9th century, I suddenly started to think about the modern period and about the questions of kind of book culture in the modern period.
Book culture and book production, I mean, that's over 1,000 years of copying the same text, right?
Yes, and I mean, of course, the question of how often a book has to be copied in 1,000 years is a question. There might be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 generations to cover such a period, but there's different ways in which books can be written on different materials. And so for paper, it's very unlikely to survive that long time of period, that long period. So it has to have a certain number of generations. Maybe at least it has to be 2, I guess, to really survive for that long time period.
Well, I'm very interested actually in how that kind of technology of book culture. You mentioned paper, which doesn't last as long as other substrates of writing. Maybe I'm thinking of parchment in medieval Europe, but it's far cheaper, and so it shapes the book culture in a different way. It's these sorts of technical aspects to a book really do shape a canon, don't they? And of course, the big example that you explore in your last book is printing, which shapes a canon in a totally different way. Because if you have scribes copying things like the one you found, that's slow, and it's a very different way of shaping which books are selected and how they're circulated to what happens in a print-based culture. Can you describe what happened to book culture over that specific period when printing became a larger part of the Arabic language book production?
Well, so to just to remind what I just said, that my interest in print comes from a kind of a medievalist and a classicist background. Much of what has been written about print was about the modern period and by scholars interested in the modern period. And so much of it was written by people who are interested in things like modern newspapers or translation movements from European thought into Arabic, and how that was aided and amplified by the technology of print. And so the thing that I was interested in is, what does this technology do to the already existing body of Arabic literature, which is a vast body of literature, right? But in terms of time period, there was more than 1,000 years since kind of the adoption of paper, which really led to a boom in book production in the Islamic world. So both a long period and a wide area in which books, and I focus on books written in Arabic, were produced. And so not just in Arabic-speaking countries, but really between West Africa, Muslim Spain, all the way to India, Indonesia, Malaysia, East Africa, down to East Africa, up into parts of Central Asia and parts that are now Russia. So there's an enormous amount of books that were created in handwritten form, and that what I'm interested in this book is how this was then translated and transformed in print and by print. And I mean, one of the first questions that people ask when talking about print is, why is it that print only emerged in the Muslim world, really, I mean, as a large-scale phenomenon in the 19th century? There were earlier ventures and attempts in the 18th century in Istanbul, but it really started as a mass phenomenon in Egypt in the 1820s.
Well, really, the first ones started before then, weren't they? They were within a generation of Gutenberg, the first attempts at Arabic language, yes, wasn't it? So we're going back hundreds of years.
Yes, but I mean one of the points of that the literature on this topic has always struggled with is this issue, why these early attempts, and we can see, very, very shortly, I mean, still in the 15th century, we have the first prints, not really in Arabic and not really by Muslims, but prints that come up, but these ventures never kind of take off. So this is a technology that exists and that is known, but that hasn't found a place in society, right? And I think that's another important point, that one doesn't kind of subscribe to technological determinism in the sense of, as soon as there is a certain technology, it has to be adopted, and that there's a certain kind of progressivist bias in this idea that whatever is possible will be done.
Yes.
But we know that ourselves, that's not actually the truth. Right? We could theoretically genetically modify our children, but I mean, it's not only it's forbidden, but that there's also a very strong stigma to the idea of doing this, of kind of cloning children or something like this. So there was a specific kind of there was a culture in which books were produced, and they were produced by scribes, and they were produced basically on demand, right? Now that's the beautiful thing about the scribal culture, that if you want a book, you can hire somebody to copy it for you, somebody who's very good at this. Not somebody like today. If you try this today, it's going to be very difficult to copy a whole book. But people who are experienced with that, and they'll write you one copy. And of course, there's a certain logic about this, that you don't have mass production of books. If you want to have 2,000 copies, that's very difficult. But the initial cost of setting this up is minimum. A scribe just needs to have some ink, a pen, and some paper. While if you want to print something, you need to have big machines. You need to have people who constantly work on this. You need to have, you need to print a certain number of copies to make this worthwhile, right? And then sell them. So you need to have a reading public that is big enough to actually be interested in this and consume this.
Right, and you need a reading public that's united in language, because the Ottoman Empire at this point had all sorts of different types of intellectual languages, if I can put it like that. You've got the bureaucratic language, you've got literary language of Ottoman Turkish and Persian, and you've got a lot of minorities publishing their religious texts in very specific languages, Hebrew, Greek, whichever, Armenian, So you haven't really got a coherent market, do you, in Arabic?
I mean, this is an important part of the story that I think people might not be aware of. That really the let's say the 300 years before the 19th century were really centuries in which Arabic was on the decline, in the sense of as a lingua franca, and that languages like Persian particularly really became the lingua franca of much of the Muslim world, at least in Asia, and even into places like Egypt. And so there is this moment at which, even in Egypt, the early printing really contains a lot of Persian and Turkish works, and it only by the late 19th century that you have this switch that primarily Arabic books are produced and consumed. So there's also it's also the story of print is also the story of the creation of a new reading public and a new market and a new language. And so part and parcel of this is mass education, the kind of explosion of literacy that creates a market that really thirsts for literature to read. And of course, I'm not denying that they were translating books from European languages and publishing them, and that they had newspapers and journals that discussed current affairs, etc. But at the same time, what is I think what my book does kind of for the first time is that it talks about the way in which print was used, and kind of selectively used, to resurrect certain parts of the Islamic intellectual tradition from this very large library that existed previously in manuscript form, and then the kind of what is actually the work that has to go into it, and the challenges that go into it, because it's very difficult. It's very difficult to do this.
Yeah, well, before we get onto the detail of that kind of intellectual kind of flowering that this brought, I just wanted to finish off on print. You unpick another myth about printing, potentially precisely what you just said, because you're coming at it from kind of the opposite perspective. You're not coming at it from this modernity project, but you're coming from the deep past and seeing this as a continuation of intellectual traditions and strands. And so one of the arguments that people have made is that it was print that revolutionized the world. And it's a claim people tend to make about a lot of different technologies, like people calling the Arab Spring a Facebook revolution, that it was down to the technology rather than the people or the ideas. And in both cases, it's a massive overstretch. I mean, you put it really well, you put in your book, the technology of print was not a cause of the transformation, as it was a site and a means of it. Can you unpack that quote a little bit?
Yeah, so there are a number of things going on very different levels of society, and very different level of there is in the case of Egypt, which I focus mostly on in this book, is you have the formation of a modern state, of a state with a bureaucracy, a centralized state that wants to educate its bureaucrats, that wants to educate its population.
And again, because it's in Egypt, it's obviously, the language of bureaucracy has shifted, hasn't it?
Yes.
We only had the Ottoman Turkish within the Ottoman Empire for the bureaucracy. So then there's a whole new type of language and text being produced, isn't there?
Yes. I mean, even until the 20th century, part of the higher echelons of Egyptian bureaucracy was speaking Turkish. Right. So you have the formation of a modern state. You have therefore also a formation of new classes, of new elites. So these were elites that knew how to read and write, but who were not necessarily tied to kind of the religious seminary culture that that previously produced most of the literate elites, right? The Al-Azhar places, the madrasa places. So you had what one would, I guess, call secular education, rise of that. You have new technologies of knowledge storage. So modern libraries are founded that are quite different compared to, I mean, there were libraries in the pre-modern period, but you had modern libraries that were founded. So there's ways in which also the way society sees itself as a particularly in the light of colonialism, of Arab intellectuals going to Europe, visiting Europe, seeing Europe, feeling both kind of interested, inspired by Europe, but also threatened, of course, by European expansion, and then the need to communicate this through kind of print media, through newspapers and journals, but then also to kind of draw on this vast ocean of intellectual tradition for the renewals of society. So this is not just kind of antiquarian interest in the classics of Islamic thought, but really a kind of constructive way in which the kind of future, Arabic Muslim future, is shaped by drawing selectively on this classical tradition. The way, I mean, in a certain way, parallel to things that happened in the Renaissance, right?
Yes, a revival in the interest of the richness of the past. Well, as you've mentioned, the European powers that are so present, obviously, at this point in the region. I mean, it's not my period, as historians love to say, but I actually know a little bit about it very tangentially because of the medieval philosophers that I read for my PhD. Now, the texts I needed had mostly been edited and published by 19th and 20th century Europeans. And the manuscripts those editions are based on are all too often held in European libraries, and they were acquired during this same time. But I had no idea until I read your book of the extent of this drain of manuscripts away from the Middle East to Europe. And it's actually quite horrifying. What was happening? What was the effect of this kind of Orientalist mania?
So yeah, I mean, there has always been movement of books, particularly from the Middle East into Europe throughout the Middle Ages. We have very old collections. We have collections in the Vatican, for example, or kind of early modern collections like the Escorial Library in Spain, etc. So there have always been books that went to Europe, but there is a kind of qualitative change in the 19th century, where with colonialism you have both the military technology. For example, when the British put down what the British call the mutiny in India, right? The rebellion against British rule. They sacked the Mughal Palace Library and basically brought this library to England, but kind of in less brutal fashion. You have a kind of a financial imbalance. You have this, even in Europe, you have foundation of these grand libraries, and they have enormous amount of funding, and they are really hungry for these books. And through kind of very often, there are these consuls, these European diplomats who live in the Middle East, and they become rich on the side by buying manuscripts in the Middle East and then selling it back to Europe. And so you have tens and probably hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that are taken from the Middle East and brought to Europe. And these Orientalists very often are interested in the most ancient manuscripts. So very often the oldest works are lost, and really no copy left in the Middle East of very old, particularly old works that Europeans were particularly interested in, like philosophical works. So in a manuscript society, you just don't have the number of copies of each work that you have in a print culture. So therefore, by the late 19th century, people in the Middle East find themselves in a situation where they are aware of their books in European libraries, because these libraries have cataloged their manuscripts, and they can read these catalogs. But these books are actually not accessible to them in the Middle East anymore, which creates a very strange, also cultural sense of alienation and of urgency, that we have been deprived of particularly our earliest works and particular types of works, philosophical works, of course, Europeans were particularly interested in. So it's a strange situation in which Europe has been able to capture not just, I mean, of course, we know in museums Europeans have brought columns and temples, etc., to Europe, entire temples, but in terms of books, this is a different thing. This is an intellectual heritage that is missing, or that has been deprived. And so print is used also as a technology of recovering these things. So there's as you mentioned, Europeans are editing Arabic works and printing them, and people in the Middle East are doing this. Of course, in the Middle East you have a much larger volume, but you also have kind of an arms race in terms of methodology, how to do this in the most scientific manner, and so on. But there is that imbalance that Edward Said used to call kind of Orientalism, in which you have this drive to know the Middle East, together with remarkable financial capabilities that really deprive the Middle East of a significant part of its heritage.
Yeah, it's a real power imbalance, the kind of through ownership of really quite, direct ownership of an intellectual tradition. I mean, is that one of the things that drives part of the nationalist agenda that you've already mentioned, that building of the libraries?
Yes, definitely. So the part of the problem is that you have these dispersed pre-modern libraries that have that are based on religious endowments. So there are these religious endowments that finance these libraries, that finance the librarians, etc. And in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, these endowments lose a lot of their value, and so these librarians get either paid a pittance, haven't had a raise for 300 years, something like this, and that leads to, of course, you don't get the best people anymore, and people start selling books from these traditional libraries. And what these modern libraries do that are founded in the Arab world, Dar al-Kutub in Egypt in 1870, the Zahiriya in Syria in 1879, is basically the state taking over, creating a central library where all these holdings of these scattered endowed libraries are forcibly brought together and preserved from further dispersal. And this is actually something that they said explicitly in these foundational documents, that this is there in order to preserve these manuscripts from being further dispersed, and being also the kind of beginning of these libraries continue to collect from private people in the Arab world over the next decades. So individuals who didn't know. I mean, if you imagine you move from a manuscript culture to a print culture, individuals kind of with time don't really know what to do anymore with these manuscripts. So what do they do with it? They now have a place where they can deposit these manuscripts. So these national libraries also grow in terms of their manuscripts from tens of thousands to really hundreds of thousands of works.
And they are very major libraries today. But that idea of a market that, as you say, the custodians of those private endowed libraries started selling them off just because they were so desperate, I suppose. That creation of a market might also, I assume, lead to a certain pressure on or temptation to forgery, which brings me to the essay that you wrote for New Lines, which was called The Hoax in the ISIS Flag. And I wonder if there's a connection there to that European book drain, that there's a pressure to produce forgeries. And because, I mean, I'll just quickly, for people who haven't read it yet, because I do recommend it. The Ottoman Sultan of the time, Abdul-Majid, he had a particular obsession, not very rare then or now or in the past, of manuscripts that were somehow linked to the Prophet Muhammad. Now, this was another very difficult need to fulfill, given the paucity of manuscripts from the 7th century. So again, it's a temptation for the greedy to fulfill that need through forgery. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Yeah. So again, the figures here are the European figures are very often connected to the diplomatic service. So these were diplomats who had some sort of Orientalist training in terms of Oriental languages, and you have a group of French diplomat scholars that are claiming that they have that one of them has discovered in a unnamed, never named Coptic Christian monastery in Upper Egypt, the original of a letter by the Prophet Muhammad to the leader of Egypt, written in the 7th century, and the French they pen a scholarly article on this in which they transcribe it, and they try to show that this is authentic and argue for its authenticity. And in European circles, this is considered for a while. And in that time period, behind the scenes, certain things can't be kind of reproduced. But this letter is offered to the Ottoman Sultan, and the Ottoman Sultan ends up buying it, and then ends up buying it for an enormous amount of money. And then you have more and more of these letters suddenly creeping out of the woodwork, so to speak. And with time, it on both sides, both in Europe and the Muslim world, people start to realize, and that really doesn't look right. And there are things that are really obviously wrong with these letters. And in fact, it becomes kind of more or less the accepted position, both among Muslim scholars and among Western scholars, that these are forged letters. But by that time, these things have become relics in the Ottoman Sultan's palace, in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, where one can see them, visit them even today. And it becomes a kind of a symbol. You have the so-called seal of the Prophet Muhammad, the kind of seal ring that he had, that he stamped his letters with, that becomes a kind of a symbol from the prophetic age, and becomes part of the Ottoman court ritual, etc., etc. And despite not having scholarly recognition, it in kind of lay religiosity, it retains this aura, and then until the early 2000s, when it gets adopted by ISIS first of all Al Qaeda in Iraq, and then ISIS, and makes it on its flag. And so there is this kind of strange continuity in which you see that there's this need for this authentic material. There's this gold rush situation in the 19th century, with artifacts, with manuscripts, and of course a lot of this stuff in the 19th century is authentic, but on the margins you have less scrupulous people who also forge things, and it just happened in this specific circumstance that the forged elements come to the forefront, because they are so it's such an attractive proposition to have a real artifact from Muhammad's lifetime. Of course, the interesting thing is in the last 20 years, we actually have discovered Quranic manuscripts that are probably from the lifetime of Muhammad, but they look much less spectacular.
They couldn't go on a flag.
That's right.
So yeah, there was an investment in believing this particular one. I mean, these European Orientalists from this time, I mean, they had an enormous effect, not just in that kind of intellectual feeding frenzy that meant that there was a huge loss of manuscripts from the region, and not just from these kind of forgeries that they used to make so much money, but it was also accompanied by the birth of many of the Orientalist myths. I mean, we've had a few of them already, but to keep within your work, I've experienced one in terms of the history of printing when we were telling the story of printing for a documentary. And I had to resist the narrative of an ignorant Ottoman sultan who banned printing, and then it didn't develop in the Middle East for another 2 or 3 centuries. Now, when I heard that explanation, I didn't know anything about the sultan nor the period, but I just knew it had this typical kind of shape and smell of an Orientalist myth. It was impossible it was true. Can you explain, if a little bit too late for my own needs of pushing back against documentary makers, why this specific story is totally irrelevant to the history of printing?
Yeah, so there are, we do have accounts of European travelers in, I think, in the 16th century that talk about an Ottoman ban of printing. So it is theoretically possible that such a ban was in place for a while in the 16th century, even though nobody has found an actual document that would be the smoking gun. Oh, it actually was banned. But the reason why this is really not really useful in explaining the absence of print in that period is that just the fact that something wasn't necessarily legal doesn't really explain why it didn't happen. There are all kind of things that weren't legal in the Ottoman Empire in that particular time period. For example, I mean, all these new things that appeared in the Ottoman world at that time, tobacco and coffee, two obviously world-changing new technologies, right? Tobacco from the New World and coffee really from Yemen and East Africa. They were both banned, but they nevertheless thrived and in the Ottoman world, and then of course exported to other places. But the question really is, I mean, kind of a 16th century Ottoman state had very limited possibilities of suppressing things that really had a need in society, that were adopted by society. So even if there had been a ban, it's difficult to imagine how this would have effectively suppressed the adoption of print. If there had been a need, if there had been a kind of a stratum of society that wanted to have printed books. And so I mean, my colleague Catherine Schwartz is really the person who has written most on this topic. But in my mind, really, it is the explanation is much more, first of all, on the economic side, and kind of on a cultural side. Like different ways. I mean, I don't know if you remember when the ebooks started coming out in the early 2000s, there were these predictions that by 2015 there would be no books printed anymore. Yeah. And in a certain sense, that it's the more rational thing. Why do we cut down all those trees and et cetera, et cetera? Why not just have them as digits? And it just didn't quite turn out that way. There's a certain percentage of the book market that is ebooks now, but it seems to be relatively stable. People want to for whatever reasons, they are attached to these physical objects. And in the same way, the Muslim world was attached to these handwritten manuscripts for quite a time period until you have the Egyptian state starting to print things and people getting used to, like, you have to get used to consuming written material in a specific way. Yeah. And once these school books are printed in Egypt and people read the newspaper every day and so on and so on, you start to get to used to the mode of print, of consuming printed material, and that's then what you also accept for book length studies. And so there's a cultural and economic explanation that I think is much more convincing than simply saying, well, there was, the kind of idea of there's an overweight man on a throne that just forbids it, and that's why it didn't happen.
So basically, nobody needed the printed books as much as they needed coffee and tobacco, right?
That's right.
So you've described all of this kind of massive social, political, technological change that was happening at this kind of time, that there was a certain response to the disappearance of the manuscripts that were ending up in European libraries. There was the nationalism, which was accompanied with the much expanded literacy rates, but also new intellectual elites like the civil servants and well, just more centers of intellectual activity. But we didn't actually talk about what that resulted in terms of the debates, the ideas in society. What was happening when things were moving out of the madrasas and Azhar and all the rest of it and being circulated more widely through printed books? What happened to intellectual culture?
Yes, the way I imagine this as a kind of as a big picture is that kind of tradition expanded, the horizon of tradition expanded in the sense that a lot of books that had basically been had fallen out of the conversation were rediscovered and reintroduced into what I call the cultural bloodstream through print. So the sense of a tradition was disturbed by this. If you imagine, like at any kind of given time, there's a limited number of ideas that are present in society, in discourse, right? And your current debate is kind of, it gets reinvigorated by people reading books like, oh, you know, I'm rereading Marx, or I'm rereading Shakespeare, or something like this. And what print did was it really allowed people to and that's a large part of my book, right? Stories of people who are traveling far and wide and discovering like one manuscript that survives of a book, and then editing it, and then the next year suddenly everybody can read this book, right? So that there is the Arabo-Islamic tradition is not a tradition that was kind of available to everybody. It was very dispersed. Much of this, you know, like multi-volume works, there was no place where all these volumes were present. But what you could do with print is you can bring these things together, you print them, and then they're suddenly almost universally available. And together with new forms of trade, then these books get spread all over the world, right? Like they get printed in Egypt one year, and the same year you can buy them in Bombay, and you can buy them in London, and you can buy them in Mombasa or in Nigeria or something like this. And so there's a widening of the debates, and particularly in the modern period when these societies really engage in radical debates about how the future should be, how modernization should proceed. You not only have whatever translations of Voltaire or of Rousseau or of John Stuart Mill to contend with, but you also have kind of indigenous ideas that are now available through print. And so the debates on the future you know, have at their disposal the kind of a richness of its own tradition. And so the kind of intellectual debates of the early 19th century, let's say, they were focused on a specific kind of spectrum of texts that people were reading. But with print, you suddenly can go back in time. You can read somebody who had been marginalized over the centuries, etc. That kind of expansion and creative usage of different parts of the intellectual tradition was really part and parcel of this movement that is in Arabic called the Nahda, right? The kind of revival or renaissance of intellectual tradition in the Arab world, in places like you know, in Beirut or Cairo or Damascus and other hubs of Arabic culture, in which people really have, you know, it's an exciting time in which people are thinking about the future, the possibilities of the future. And what this research about print and classics, I think, adds is to show that it wasn't just about European ideas, or not even primarily about European ideas, but much of this was about people going into manuscript libraries and just reading stuff, and then what they found interesting, taking out of there and then printing it and making it universally available.
Well, as you talk, you're kind of countering another Orientalist myth. In this case, it's one that I find particularly pernicious. I still hear it. It's the one seeing the history of Arabic and Islamic philosophy as somehow slowly dying off, kind of, I don't know, 13th, 14th century, beginning the decline after that so-called golden age. And then it's only revived by Europeans bringing modernity. And of course, that's a complicated term in itself. But how would you characterize the alternative picture? You actually present it in your book, not that Europeans are kind of grafting on modernity, but there's been, that revival you just described of a far bigger, vast backstory.
So, I mean, first of all, I push back against this idea that you have basically two periods in Islamic thought. One of them is kind of the pre-modern, and then there's the modern. And the pre-modern is like one thing, one unitary thing, and then there's the modern. What I want to show is that there are, even in the pre-modern written culture, there's different times, there's different levels of literacy. I think I'm arguing in hopefully convincingly in my book that in the 2 centuries preceding print, you have a decline in public libraries, right? In the availability of public libraries, and that also makes it easier for Europeans to buy up a lot of these books. So I'm not saying everything was rosy or necessarily positive in terms of the book market that existed in the Arab world before print. But what you mentioned is that there is a new attitude towards the tradition that we see emerging in the age of print, which is that you are able to draw on the tradition for your purposes of a specific historical moment. It is not that the tradition is one single thing, that the tradition gives you one answer to every question, but that the tradition has a whole host of answers, of possible answers that you can choose from, that seems most appropriate for your specific transformation that you want to achieve. So the tradition is not a static and necessarily conservative source, but it in fact is a source for imagining yourself in different ways. So you have different types of intellectuals that draw on different types of the tradition to argue for their specific positions, whether you are looking for kind of political unity, whether you're looking for kind of cultural revivification, whether you're looking for martial values in resisting European incursion. So the tradition becomes a kind of a resource of possibility rather than constraint. And because that's something that we think about, in terms of modernity and pre-modernity, that in modernity we are in charge of our past, right? And we can kind of we can forget about the things that we don't like, and we can draw on the things that we like. While in pre-modernity we were kind of victims to the past, right? The tradition just ruled over us, and in a certain way, print has this effect on Arabo-Islamic kind of intellectual debates, namely that people kind of by printing these texts, they might be reviving things that had really fallen out of the tradition that nobody knew about anymore, and that kind of adds something very different to a tradition than just re-teaching the text that you have taught, that your teacher has taught you, and he or she were taught by their teachers, etc., etc. So that kind of new relationship to one's own past, I think that is the big change that happens.
Yeah, well, I wondered, after covering such a huge amount of history as you have, starting in the 9th century for your PhD and getting all the way up to the 20th century, looking at how that tradition was drawn on, as you've just described, I wonder if you could tell us, to wrap up, anything about what you're working on now, which is the formation of Sunnism. You've gone right back, haven't you? Now, Sunnism for many people means the mainstream of Islam, right? What drew you to this topic?
Well, I mean, I'm always interested in how things relate how there are questions that we somehow take for granted in understanding the world, but then we actually don't quite know what we are talking about. And if you look at the term Sunnism, somehow anybody and everybody, who gives a basic introduction to Islam will use the word Sunni or Sunnism. But then once you actually come to the definition, or once you come to what like when did it start, such a simple question, people will radically disagree about this. And so what I want to show is that Sunnism is a really a term that is not that has many meanings. That has many meanings today. There are debates, right now as we speak, 21st century debates about the nature of Sunnism, and you can follow both the roots and the variety of debates all the way back into the 8th century when the term for Sunnism, or the Arabic term for Sunnism, Ahl Sunnah al Jama'ah, emerged. And so what I want to, the reason why I call this book, what I want to call this book, Genealogies of Sunnism, is to show that these various definitions, they are related to each other, but they always come in new garb. So it's not a single. Sunnism is not a simple phenomenon. It's not a simple group of people that you can just say, okay, these are the Sunnis, and we can trace them through history. But it's really, what it means to be Sunni changes quite radically over the period of time. But there's nevertheless a kind of a family resemblance between these things. So I want to bring this term from a simple slogan to a really kind of historically graspable kind of concept.
Well, I look forward to the results very much indeed, and hope we can publish something in New Lines as well. Ahmed El Shamsy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Lydia.
You can buy Ahmed's book, Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, How Editors and Print Culture Transformed an Intellectual Tradition, in all good bookshops, and follow him on Twitter at @A_L_Shamsy. His essay, The Hoax in the ISIS Flag, is available to read at newlinesmag.com. This week's podcast was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Lydia Wilson. You can subscribe to the New Lines Magazine podcast on your favourite podcast app, and of course you can find more of the best stories from the Middle East and beyond on our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us.